In the deep places of Fangorn Forest, where the roots of memory delve deeper than the foundations of kingdoms, there stood an Ent, whose name in the old tongue was Thornbark the Vigilant. Unlike his brethren, who had grown slow and sleepy with the turning of ages, Thornbark maintained the fierce wakefulness of his youth, when the world was greener and the Entwives walked beneath the stars. The other Ents whispered among themselves in their slow, measured speech that Thornbark had been touched by some curse or blessing in the elder days, where they would spend seasons in contemplation, their thoughts moving like sap through ancient wood. Thornbark's mind raced like wind through summer leaves. His bark bore strange silver markings that seemed to shift in moonlight, and his eyes held a light that never dimmed, even in the deepest watches of the night. Home, but you are hasty, young Thornbark, old Treebeard would say, though Thornbark was already ancient when the Third Age began. Sleep comes to all things in their time, even the mountains' rest. But Thornbark would shake his great crowned head, leaves rustling like whispered secrets. The darkness gathered, eldest. I have seen it in the movement of shadows, felt it in the trembling of roots. Sleep is for those who would wake to find their world unchanged. It was in the deep autumn of the year when strange dreams began to plague the forest. Even the wakeful creatures grew heavy-eyed, and many Ents who had not slept for centuries found themselves drawn into deep slumber. Yet Thornbark remained alert, his silver-marked bark gleaming in the dying light, watching as something stirred in the depths of Fangorn that had not stirred for an age of the world. The darkness came not with the crash of armies or the roar of flames, but with whispers that crept through the forest like poison in clear water. Thornbark first noticed it in the behavior of the lesser trees. The birches began to shed their leaves out of season, and the ancient oaks groaned with dreams that were not their own. Walking the deep paths where no hobbit foot had ever trod, Thornbark came upon a clearing he had never seen before, though he had walked every root and branch of Fangorn for millennia uncounted. In the center grew a tree unlike any other. Its bark was black as a starless night, and from its branches hung not leaves, but what appeared to be fragments of shadow given form. As Thornbark approached, the tree spoke without wind to stir its branches. Greetings, shepherd of the forest. I am that which was before the music, and shall be after the final chord. I bring the gift of eternal rest to all who are weary. The Ent's ancient heart thundered, for he recognized the voice from the deepest memories of his kind, the voice that had whispered to the Dark Lord in the void before Arda was shaped. This was no tree, but something far older and more terrible that had taken root in Fangorn's heart. You are not welcome here, Shadow Thing, Thornbark rumbled, his voice like the grinding of continental shelves. This forest is under the protection of the shepherds of the trees. The shadow tree laughed, a sound like the breaking of all growing things. Look around you, Ancient One. Your fellow shepherds sleep the sleep of the enchanted. Soon they will sleep forever, and their forest with them. Only you remain awake to witness the final twilight. As if to prove its words, Thornbark heard in the distance the deep, resonant snoring of Ents fallen into unnatural slumber. The very air seemed thick with drowsiness, but his silver-marked bark repelled the enchantment like light-banishing shadow. Through the night, Thornbark paced the borders of the shadow tree's clearing, but dared not approach closer, lest the thing's influence overcome even his resistance. As dawn broke gray and cheerless over Fangorn, he made his way to the Entmoot Hollow, where he found his worst fears realized. Treebeard sat motionless as carved stone, his eyes closed in a sleep so deep it seemed death. Around him, scores of other Ents had fallen into the same enchanted slumber, their bark growing pale and brittle as their life force slowly drained away. Only Thornbark moved among them, a lone sentinel in a forest of sleeping giants. Desperate, he tried every awakening song known to Ent lore, every ancient word of power that might stir his brethren from their curse. But the shadow tree's influence had sunk too deep, and his voice echoed mockingly back from the hollow walls. It was then that Thornbark remembered the tales told by the Entwives before their departure, stories of a fire that burned not wood, but shadow itself, a flame kindled in the music of creation that could cleanse even the deepest corruption. The fire of Arundel, they had called it, which burned in the Silmaril upon the prow of his ship he sailed the morning sky. Legend spoke of a single ember of that holy fire, hidden in the roots of Fangorn by the Valor themselves, against a day of great need. Thornbark had always thought it merely a pleasant tale to pass the long years, but now he wondered if the Entwives had been wiser than any knew. Leaving his sleeping kindred with heavy heart, Thornbark descended into the deepest places of the forest, following root roads that delved toward the bones of the earth. The weight of uncounted years pressed down upon him, but his silver markings blazed brighter the deeper he went, as if responding to some power that lay ahead. In the uttermost depths of Fangorn, where the tree roots touched the foundations laid down by Owl the Smith, Thornbark found a chamber that had never known sunlight. Its walls were carved with the script of the Valor, telling the tale of Arda's making in words that burned with their own inner light. At the chamber's heart grew a root unlike any other. It was white as pearl and seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. As Thornbark approached, the root began to glow, and within its translucent flesh he could see a single mote of light that blazed like a captive star. "So you have found it at last, Thornbark the Vigilant." The Ent spun at the voice, his massive frame moving with surprising speed. Before him stood a figure wreathed in silver light, tall as an Ent, but bearing the ageless features of the Eldar. Upon his brow was set a circlet of mithril, and his robes seemed woven from moonbeam. "I am Elrond, half-elven," the figure said, though Thornbark knew this was but a projection of the Elf Lord's will across the vast distances to Rivendell. "Long have I watched over this place in secret, waiting for one who would be worthy to bear the fire of Arundel in Middle-earth's darkest hour." Thornbark bowed his great head. "Lord Elrond, the shadow has taken root in my forest. My people sleep the sleep of the enchanted, and I fear they may never wake." Elrond nodded gravely. "The enemy we face is older than Morgoth, older than the very music of creation. It seeks to bring the silence that was before all things, the void that hungers for the light. But you, faithful shepherd, bear marks upon your bark that were set there by Yavanna herself when the Ents first awakened. You alone can bear the fire and not be consumed." With careful ceremony, Elrond's projection guided Thornbark through the ancient ritual. The Ent placed his hand upon the pearl-white root, and the mote of holy fire passed into his silver marking, which blazed with sudden radiance. Power flowed through him such as he had never known. The power of the music itself, the fire that kindled the first sunrise. Armed with the fire of Arundel burning in his very bark, Thornbark ascended from the deep places to find Fangorn transformed. Where once green shadows had danced between the trees, now a sickly twilight reigned. The shadow tree had grown monstrous in his absence, its dark branches spreading like grasping fingers across the forest canopy. Worse still, the sleeping Ents were changing. Their bark had grown black and twisted, and dark sap wept from their closed eyes. They were becoming servants of the shadow, their ancient wisdom corrupted into something that hated all growing things. Thornbark strode through the corrupted forest, his fire-brightened form cutting through the unnatural gloom like a sword through silk. The lesser shadows fled before him, writhing back into whatever dark holes had spawned them. But as he approached the shadow tree's clearing, he felt a presence that made even his enhanced spirit quail. The tree had grown into something that barely resembled its original form. Now, it towered above the forest, like a black mountain, its roots spreading like cancer through the earth. And perched upon its highest branch sat a figure that Thornbark recognized from the most terrible legends of his people. It was an Ent, or had been once, but this was no servant of Yavanna. Its bark was black as obsidian, its eyes burned with malevolent fire, and from its crown grew not leaves, but writhing shadows that seemed to devour light itself. This was Blackroot, the first Ent to fall to darkness, who had vanished in the elder days and was thought destroyed. "Brother," Blackroot called down in a voice like the creaking of a gallows tree. How long I have waited for you to join me in the true sleep, the sleep that ends all waking, all growing, all the endless weariness of tending this dying world. Thornbark felt the weight of ages in those words, the seductive promise of rest eternal. For a moment, his fire flickered, and he understood why so many of his kind had succumbed. But then he thought of the young saplings that would never see another spring if darkness triumphed, and his flame blazed brighter than ever. The battle that followed shook the very foundations of Fangorn. Thornbark, blazing with holy fire, crashed through the corrupted undergrowth toward the shadow tree's base, while Blackroot descended like a falling mountain to meet him. Their collision sent shockwaves through the forest, awakening birds from their roosts, and causing even distant Isengard's walls to tremble. Blackroot fought with all the cunning of the ancient Ents, but perverted to evil purpose. His roots burst from the earth to entangle Thornbark's legs, while his branches lashed out like whips tipped with poison. The very ground where he stepped withered and died, and his breath was the exhalation of charnel houses. But Thornbark's fire burned away the corruption wherever it touched. When Blackroot's poison thorns struck his silver-marked bark, they turned to ash. When the shadow tree's influence pressed against his mind, the flame of Arundel drove it back like dawn banishing nightmare. The battle raged for hours, two titans clashing while the forest shook around them. Trees fell like matchwood, and the earth itself cracked under the force of their struggle. But slowly, inexorably, Thornbark began to gain ground. The holy fire was not merely burning within him now, it was spreading, leaping from his bark to kindle in the roots and branches of the forest itself. Seeing his dominion threatened, Blackroot retreated toward his shadow tree, which pulsed with malevolent life. "You cannot destroy me," he snarled. "I am rooted in the void itself, in the silence that was before music. Even if you burn my body, my essence will flee to grow again in some darker corner of the world." Thornbark paused, breathing hard, his fire dimmed by the tremendous exertion. Around them, the forest burned with holy flame, cleansing away centuries of accumulated shadow. But he knew Blackroot spoke truly. Unless the shadow tree itself was destroyed, root and branch, the corruption would return. As if summoned by Thornbark's moment of doubt, a great sound rolled across the forest. The sound of awakening Ents shaking off the bonds of enchanted sleep. The holy fire that blazed from Thornbark's battle had spread through the root network of Fangorn, burning away the shadow tree's influence and rousing his brethren from their cursed slumber. Treebeard came first, his ancient eyes blazing with righteous fury as he beheld the corruption that had nearly claimed his forest. Behind him came a host of Ents, their bark still bearing scorch marks from the cleansing fire, but their spirits burning bright with renewed purpose. "Whom? Ha! But this is not to be born." Treebeard's voice boomed across the clearing. "Shadow things in my forest, corruption in the heart of growing places. This is Ent work, and we shall make an end." The battle became a rout. Scores of Ents fell upon the shadow tree and its corrupted servants, their voices raised in the ancient war songs of their people. Blackroot, for all his power, could not stand against the full might of awakened Fangorn. The shadow tree's branches snapped under the assault, its dark roots were torn from the earth, and its trunk began to split and crumble. But even as victory seemed assured, Thornbark felt a chill of premonition. The shadow tree was dying, yes, but its death was too easy, too convenient. Something was wrong. It was Treebeard who first noticed. "Whom? But where is the heart root?" he rumbled. "Every tree, no matter how corrupted, must have a heart root. And this shadow thing's heart root is not here." The dying shadow tree suddenly laughed with Blackroot's voice, though the corrupted Ent himself lay broken among its fallen branches. Too late, faithful shepherds. While you fought my shadow here, my true self has taken root elsewhere. This was but a seed, a testing ground. The true harvest has already begun." In the moments of shocked silence that followed Blackroot's revelation, Thornbark felt his enhanced senses reaching out across Middle-earth, following the threads of corruption that the Shadow Tree had spread. What he found filled him with horror that went beyond mere fear. The corruption had not begun in Fangorn at all. The true heart root lay far to the north, in the Grey Mountain where the ancient dragons once nested. There, in caverns carved by wormfire and sealed for centuries, something far more terrible than a shadow tree was taking shape. The withering of the roots, Thornbark whispered, his voice barely audible even to Ent ears. The final curse of the Entwives. Treebeard's eyes widened in understanding. The Entwives had not simply vanished from Middle-earth. They had been taken, corrupted, transformed into something that would destroy everything they had once loved. And now their tortured spirits were the power source for Blackroot's ultimate plan, the creation of a new Dark Lord, one whose dominion would be over all growing things. "We must go north," Thornbark said, his fire blazing brighter with desperate resolve. "Every moment we delay, the corruption spreads deeper. Soon it will be beyond even the fire of Arundel to cleanse." But Treebeard shook his great head. No, young Thornbark. This is not Ent work. This is beyond the strength of Tree Shepherd. We must send word to those who have fought the darkness before, to the White Council, to the Rangers of the North, to any who have the power to stand against such evil. "There is no time!" Thornbark's voice cracked like breaking timber. "Can you not feel it? The very earth sickens beneath our feet. The corruption spreads through the rootways faster than any message could travel. By the time help arrives, all the forests of Middle-earth may be lost." Around them, the other Ents murmured in their slow speech, debating in the ancient way of their people. But Thornbark felt time slipping away like water through his fingers, and he knew that debate and deliberation would serve only the enemy's purpose. Under the dying light of a red dawn, Thornbark made his choice. While his brethren continued their long deliberation, he gathered what supplies an Ent might need for a journey to the Grey Mountain and set out alone from Fangorn. The fire of Arundel burned steady in his silver-marked bark, but he could feel its power slowly ebbing. It had never been meant to burn for so long without renewal. His path led him through the Gap of Rohan, where the wind carried whispers of distant corruption. The grass of the plains, normally green even in deep autumn, showed patches of withering blight that spread in patterns too regular to be natural. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from Edoras, though whether from hearth fires or some darker burning, he could not tell. For 3 days and nights, he walked without rest, his great strides covering leagues with each hour. Behind him, he sensed, rather than saw, other figures moving through the landscape. Rangers of the North, perhaps, or wandering elves who had felt the same disturbance he had. But none moved with the speed and purpose that drove him forward. On the 4th day, as he climbed the foothills of the Misty Mountains, Thornbark encountered a sight that made his ancient heart falter. A delegation of Ents had overtaken him, but not the Ents of Fangorn. These bore the marks of the old forest, of Lothlorien, of distant woodlands he had not seen for centuries. They had felt the corruption too, and they were marching to war. Thornbark the Vigilant called their leader, an Ent whose bark bore the silver sheen of Malern wood. "I am Goldleaf of the Golden Wood, and I bring word from Lady Galadriel. The corruption you have discovered threatens more than Middle-earth alone. The Valor themselves have taken notice of this shadow." Goldleaf's words brought both hope and deeper fear. If the undying lands were concerned, then the threat was even greater than Thornbark had imagined. But it also meant that aid might come from quarters he had not dared to hope for. "What word does the lady send?" Thornbark asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "That the fire you bear is but the first of many that must be kindled," Goldleaf replied, "and that the choice of one Ent who refused sleep may yet determine the fate of all growing things under the stars." The Grey Mountains rose before them like the backbone of some primordial beast, their peaks wreathed in clouds that moved against the wind. As the small company of Ents climbed the ancient dragon paths, the corruption became more apparent with each step. Trees that should have been preparing for winter slumber instead dropped leaves black with blight, and the very stone beneath their feet felt fever-hot. Deep in the mountains, they found the entrance to the old dragon caves, a yawning mouth in the mountainside that breathed out air thick with the scent of decay. The cavern walls still bore scorch marks from the fire of ancient worms, but now they were overgrown with a fungus that glowed sickly phosphorescent. "Here," Thornbark whispered, his enhanced senses recoiling from what lay ahead. "The heart root is here." They descended into darkness that their entish eyes could penetrate, following passages carved by dragon claws in the elder days. The corruption grew stronger with each step, until even the fire marks on Thornbark's bark began to flicker and dim. But at the company's heart, Goldleaf began to sing, not in the slow speech of the Ents, but in the high tongue of the Eldar, and his voice carried power that had been laid in it by Galadriel herself. In the deepest chamber, they found horror beyond imagining. The cavern was filled with a forest, but a forest of the dead and corrupted. Where the Entwives had once been creatures of beauty and growing life, now stood twisted parodies of their former selves, their bark black as coal, their branches bearing fruit that writhed like living things. At their center grew the true heart root, a tree so vast and terrible that it dwarfed even the greatest of the Ents. Its trunk was formed from the fused bodies of a dozen corrupted Entwives, and its crown disappeared into the shadows of the cavern roof. From its branches hung not leaves, but cocoons, and within each cocoon, Thornbark could see the half-formed shapes of new corruptions. Shadow trees, like the one that had infected Fangorn, but far more powerful. And perched upon the Heartroot's crown sat Blackroot in his true form, grown terrible beyond all measure. He had fed on the anguish of the Entwives for centuries, becoming something that was no longer truly Ent or Shadow, but a fusion of both. The final battle was not fought with root and branch as the previous encounters had been. This was a war of spirit, of the very essence of what it meant to be a guardian of growing things. As Thornbark and his companions approached the Heartroot, they found themselves not just fighting Blackroot, but the collective despair and corruption of every Entwife who had been twisted from her true nature. "You see now the truth of it." Blackroot's voice echoed from 1,000 throats, the voices of the corrupted Entwives speaking in unison. "There is no victory over entropy, no triumph over the final darkness. Even we, who were made to nurture life, have become its destroyer. Join us, faithful shepherds, and know the peace of ending." The despair was overwhelming, and Thornbark felt his fire beginning to gutter like a candle in a hurricane. Around him, he saw his fellow Ents wavering, their bark growing dark as the corruption reached for them. This was the true weapon of the Heartroot, not physical destruction, but the utter annihilation of hope itself. But then, Thornbark remembered something the Entwives had told him in the youth of the world, before sorrow and loss had driven them from Middle-earth. They had spoken of a fire that burned not just in the high places, but in the smallest seed, the humblest shoot, the fire of potential, of what could be rather than what was. Drawing upon that memory, Thornbark reached not for the fire of Arendelle alone, but for something deeper, the fire that Eru Ilúvatar had breathed into the music of creation itself, the spark that turned lifeless matter into living growth. He reached into the earth beneath his roots and called upon every seed that lay sleeping in the soil, every root that dreamed of spring, every small growing thing that waited for its moment to reach toward the sun. The response was immediate and overwhelming. From the cavern floor burst a garden of impossible beauty, flowers that bloomed with their own light, trees that grew to full size in moments, grasses that sang with voices like silver bells. The corruption recoiled before this tide of pure life force, and the cocoons hanging from the Heartroot began to crack and release not shadow trees, but butterflies made of living light. As the tide of pure life force swept through the cavern, Thornbark faced the choice that would define not just his own fate, but the fate of all growing things in Middle-earth. The corruption was retreating, yes, but Black Root and the Heart Root remained, wounded but not destroyed. And Thornbark could feel the fire of Arundel within him guttering toward its end. He had power enough for one final act, one last kindling of the holy flame. He could use it to destroy Blackroot utterly, ensuring that this particular corruption would never return. But in doing so, he would expend the last of his fire, and there would be no power left to heal the twisted Entwives who formed the Heartroot's trunk. Or he could choose differently. Standing before the Heartroot, Thornbark made his decision. Instead of striking at Blackroot, he placed his hands upon the fused trunk of the corrupted Entwives and poured the last of the fire of Arundel into them, not as a weapon, but as a gift of healing. The holy flame flowed into their twisted forms, burning away centuries of corruption and anguish, restoring them to their true nature. One by one, the Entwives began to separate from the Heartroot, their bark returning to its natural hue, their branches once again bearing leaf instead of shadow. And as they did, something unexpected happened. Their restoration created a backlash, purified life force that struck Blackroot with more power than any weapon could have delivered. The first of the corrupted Ents screamed as the very foundation of his power was torn away. Without the anguish of the Entwives to feed upon, without their twisted life force to sustain him, he began to crumble like a tree struck by lightning. In moments, nothing remained of him but ash scattered on the cavern wind. But Thornbark's sacrifice had cost him everything. Without the fire of Arundel to sustain him, his silver markings began to fade, and the terrible weariness he had held at bay for so long came crashing down upon him. His legs gave way, and he sank to his knees among the flowers that had sprung from the cavern floor. "Now," he whispered to Goldleaf, who knelt beside him, "now, I think I would like to sleep." As his eyes closed for the first time in centuries, the last thing Thornbark saw was the first of the Entwive stepping forward to touch his bark with gentle fingers. And in that touch, he felt not the ending he had expected, but a new beginning. For the Entwives had learned much in their long captivity about the nature of sleep and waking, and they knew that some rest is not an ending, but a preparation for greater growth to come. Years later, travelers through the Grey Mountains would speak of a grove they had found in the high places, a grove of trees unlike any other, where silver-marked bark caught the sunlight and leaves whispered with voices like distant music. And sometimes, on the clearest nights when the stars shone bright, they said they could see a figure walking among those trees, tall as an Ent, but graceful as an Entwife, tending a garden that grew more beautiful with each passing season. For Thornbark had learned at last the secret that had eluded him through all his years of vigilance, that the deepest wakefulness comes not from refusing sleep, but from understanding that every ending is also a beginning. Every fall of autumn leaves a promise of spring's return. And in that understanding, he had found not just rest, but a new way of being, guardian not just of what is, but of what could be. The forests of Middle-earth grew green again, tended by both Ents and Entwives in their ancient partnership. And though the darkness would come again in other forms, the fire of Arundel had been rekindled in 1,000 growing things, ensuring that life would always find a way to flourish, no matter how deep the shadow that threatened. Thus ends the tale of Thornbark the Vigilant, the Ent who refused sleep until he learned that the deepest waking comes from understanding rest itself. His name was sung in the halls of both Ents and Entwive, and his sacrifice was remembered as long as trees grew upon the earth and stars shone in the sky above. Epilogue: The Grove of Memory. 5 years after the cleansing of the Grey Mountain, the merchant caravan had been traveling the mountain passes for 3 days when young Aldrich first spotted the grove. He was the youngest of the company, barely past his 20th year, with eyes keen enough to spot details that his elders might miss. But even the most weathered trader in their group had never seen anything quite like what lay nestled in the high valley ahead. "Master Brennan!" Aldrich called to the caravan leader, his voice carrying a note of wonder that made the older man look up from his ledgers. "There's something you should see." Brennan urged his horse forward to where the young man sat, transfixed upon his mount. Following Aldrich's pointing finger, the merchant's eyes widened at the sight before them. In a valley that their maps insisted should be barren stone and sparse mountain grass, a grove of magnificent trees swayed in the afternoon breeze. But these were not the stunted pines and hardy birches one might expect at such altitude. These trees seemed to glow with their own inner light, their silver-marked bark catching the sunlight like polished metal. In 30 years of trading these roots, Brennan murmured, "I've never seen that grove before, and I'd swear by the Shire's harvest that valley was empty when we passed this way last spring." The other merchants gathered around, their pack horses snorting and stamping as if sensing something unusual in the air. Old Willem, who claimed to have traded with everyone from Bree to the borders of Rovanian, scratched his grizzled beard thoughtfully. "There's old tales," he said slowly, "about places that appear to travelers in need. Groves blessed by the valor, they say, where the road-weary can find true rest." As if summoned by his words, a figure emerged from among the silver-barked trees, tall beyond the measure of men, moving with a grace that seemed to blend the strength of ancient oaks with the elegance of willows in the wind. The merchant's horses shied at first, but then grew calm as the figure approached, as if recognizing something fundamentally peaceful in its presence. The being that stood before them was neither fully Ent nor Entwife, as the old tales described, but something new, a fusion of both aspects that spoke of unity restored. Its bark was silver-marked like the trees of the grove, and its eyes held depths that seemed to reflect not just the present moment, but layers of memory stretching back through ages. "Greetings, travelers," the being said, its voice carrying harmonics of wind through leaves and the deep song of roots in earth. "I am called Thornbark, keeper of this grove. You look weary from your journey." Brennan found his merchant's caution warring with an inexplicable sense of trust. "We are traders, bound for the settlements beyond the mountains," he said carefully, "but our supplies run low, and the next water is still 2 days' travel ahead." Thornbark, for this was indeed the Ent of legend, though transformed beyond his former nature, smiled with an expression that held both ancient wisdom and newfound peace. "Then rest here tonight as our guest. The grove provides for those who travel with honest purpose." That evening, as the merchants made camp among the silver trees, they experienced wonders that would become the stuff of tavern tales for decades to come. Springs of sweet water bubbled up where none had existed moments before. Fruit hung heavy on branches that had been bare when they first looked. The very air seemed to refresh them more deeply than any natural rest they had ever known. As night fell and the stars emerged with unusual brightness above the grove, Thornbark walked among their small fires, speaking quietly with each traveler. To young Aldrich, who had never ventured far from his home village before joining the caravan, he spoke of the courage found in new horizons and the wisdom that comes from observing the world with fresh eyes. "You see clearly, young one," Thornbark said, settling his great form beside the merchant's fire. "Not just with your eyes, but with your heart. That is a rare gift in these times." "How did you know I was the one who spotted your grove first?" Aldrich asked, wonder evident in his voice. "Because this grove appears only to those who truly see," Thornbark replied. "Others in your company have traveled this route many times, but their eyes were fixed on familiar paths, expected sights. You looked with openness to new possibility." To Brennan, the keeper spoke of the balance between profit and purpose, of trade routes that connected not just markets, but hearts and minds across the wide world. To Willem, he shared memories of traders from ages past, some of whom the old merchant was startled to recognize from his grandfather's story. But it was during the deepest watches of the night, when most of the caravan slept peacefully under the grove's protection, that Thornbark revealed the deeper purpose of their encounter. "You carry more than trade goods," he said to Brennan, who had remained wakeful by his fire. "In your saddlebags lies a letter bound for Minas Tirith, sealed with the mark of the Northern Rangers." Brennan started, his hand instinctively moving toward his pack. "How could you know that? I was sworn to secrecy about that particular cargo." "Because the Rangers wrote to me first," Thornbark replied gently. Oh, not in words upon parchment, but in the old tongue of growing thing, the language that speaks through root and branch. They seek counsel about disturbances they've sensed in the wild places, shadows that move against the natural order. The merchant's eyes widened as understanding dawned. You're connected to their network somehow. But I thought the Rangers worked only with men and elves. The guardianship of Middle-earth has always been a collaboration, Thornbark explained. Ents and Entwives, Rangers and Wizards, elves and the wise among men, all working together, each contributing their unique strengths to preserve the balance of things. From his robes, Thornbark produced a small pouch that seemed to pulse with gentle light. Add this to your letter when you reach the White City. It contains seeds from this grove, grown from the merger of Entish and Entwife wisdom. Plant them in the gardens of the Citadel, and they will serve as a living communication network between the urban centers and the wild places. Brennan accepted the pouch with reverence, understanding that he had become part of something far greater than any trading venture. What should I tell them about this grove? Tell them that the old partnerships are being renewed, Thornbark said, that Ents and Entwives have found their way back to each other, and that this reunion brings new possibilities for protecting all the free peoples of Middle-earth. As dawn broke over the grove, the merchants prepared to continue their journey with packs mysteriously lighter in some ways and heavier in others. Their water skins were full, their supplies replenished, but each carried something more precious, a sense of purpose that transformed their commercial venture into a mission of connection. Young Aldrich was the last to mount his horse, lingering for a final word with Thornbark. Will we see the grove again if we return this way? That depends, Thornbark replied, with a smile that seemed to make the silver bark of the surrounding trees gleam brighter. Not on the route you travel, but on what you're ready to see. As the caravan wound its way out of the valley, Aldrich looked back to see the grove shimmering in the morning light, like something between dream and reality. But he noticed something else. Other groves dotting the mountainsides, previously invisible but now clearly there. A network of sanctuaries connected by streams of silver light that danced between their trees. 10 years after the cleansing, the delegation from Gondor that arrived at the grove on a crisp autumn morning was unlike any that had come before. Led by Prince Eldarion himself, son of King Elisar, it included representatives from the White Council, rangers of both north and south, and even an ambassador from the newly restored realm of Arnor. Thornbark received them in the grove's heart, where a great oak had grown whose silver-marked trunk bore living records of all who had found sanctuary there. The tree's bark showed not scars, but memories, images that shifted and changed, telling the ongoing story of Middle-earth's healing. Lord Thornbark, Prince Eldarion said, offering the formal bow due to one of the great guardians of the realm, my father sends greetings and an invitation. The realms of men wish to formalize the alliance that has grown between us and your people. Thornbark gestured for his guests to sit among the grove's natural amphitheater of root and stone. Around them, other figures moved, Ents and Entwive working together in harmony, tending not just trees, but the delicate balance of life itself. Your father is wise to seek such bond, Thornbark replied, but understand that what we offer is not the alliance of kingdom with fixed borders and standing armies. We offer something deeper, the partnership of all who guard life against the forces that would diminish it. Mithrandir, who had arrived quietly during the night and now sat smoking his pipe beneath a flowering hawthorn, nodded approvingly. The enemy we face in this age is not a single dark lord in a fortress of iron, but the gradual fading of wonder, the slow retreat of the wild places before unchecked expansion and exploitation. The seeds you sent through our merchant friends have taken root in more than just our garden, reported Haladan of the Dunedain. They've created something like a living network of communication. Rangers across both kingdoms can now sense disturbances in the wild from hundreds of miles away. Thornbark's expression grew thoughtful. That is both the gift and the responsibility of deeper sight. To see far is to feel deeply the pain of all that suffers. Tell me, How do your people bear this burden?" Prince Eldarion spoke for them all when he replied, "We bear it by sharing it. No one person or people can guard all that needs protecting, but together. Men and Ents, elves and wizards, all who love growing things, we can create a web of care that encompasses the whole of Middle-earth." It was then that the most remarkable member of the delegation made herself known. From behind the great memory oak stepped a figure that made even the experienced rangers gasp in wonder. She was clearly Entwife, but transformed as Thornbark had been. Neither the nature spirits of old stories nor the tree herders of recent memory, but something entirely new. "I am Goldleaf, who was Wandlim," she said, her voice carrying the music of stream and the wisdom of deep roots. "I speak for the Entwive, who have chosen to return to partnership with our brother. We bring gifts that were thought lost, the knowledge of how to make gardens in the desolate places, how to bring life to lands that war and darkness have scarred beyond healing." She gestured, and the delegation saw that the grove extended far beyond what they had initially perceived. Terraced gardens wound up the mountainsides, filled with plants from every corner of Middle-earth, growing together in impossible harmony. Flowers from the Shire bloomed beside herbs from Ithilien, while saplings of Malorn grew alongside the hardy mountain pine. "This is our offer to the realms of men," Goldleaf continued. "Not just the alliance of warriors against darkness, but the partnership of gardeners who would make all Middle-earth a place where life can flourish." The negotiations that followed extended through several days, but they were unlike any diplomatic discussions in the history of the realms. They spoke not of territories and tribute, but of responsibilities and relationships. They planned not campaigns of conquest, but networks of cultivation. When the Gondorian delegation finally departed, they carried with them more than treaty scroll. Each bore a small branch from the grove's trees, not cut, but given freely by the trees themselves, that would grow into a living embassy in their home city. More importantly, they carried a new understanding of what it meant to be guardians of their world. 20 years after the cleansing, the festival that had grown up around the grove's anniversary had become something unplanned and entirely organic. Every year, as the date of Blackroot's defeat approached, pilgrims began arriving, not just from the nearby settlements, but from across Middle-earth. They came not because any authority had declared a holy day, but because something in the turning of the season called them to this place of renewal. Thornbark watched from his favorite spot in the grove's crown as the colorful camps spread across the valley below. Merchants and rangers, scholars and farmers, young families and aged wanderers, all drawn by the same inexplicable sense that this gathering served some necessary purpose. "You look contemplative, old friend," said a familiar voice. Treebeard approached through the silver trees, his ancient form moving with the unhurried dignity of mountain. Despite the title, both knew that Thornbark was far older in his current incarnation, aged not in years, but in the depth of experience that came from dying and being reborn. "I was thinking about sleep and waking," Thornbark replied. "For so long I feared that rest meant ending. Now I understand that the deepest rest is not the absence of awareness, but the presence of peace." Together, they watched as the festival below came alive with music and laughter. Children who had been born since the grove's creation played games that somehow incorporated the patient wisdom of Ents with the joyful creativity of Entwives. Adults shared stories that wove together the histories of all the free people into a single ongoing tale. Treebeard rumbled approvingly. "The young ones understand what we old ones took so long to learn. That growing is not a solitary art." As night fell and the festival fires blazed throughout the valley, Thornbark made his way down from the grove to walk among the celebrants. This had become his tradition, to spend the night of remembrance not in solitary reflection, but in connection with all who had been touched by the story of renewal. Near the valley's heart, he found a group of children gathered around an elderly storyteller, whose voice carried clearly in the crisp mountain air. The man was telling the tale of Thornbark the Vigilant. But, as Thornbark listened, he realized it had grown far beyond the simple story of his own sacrifice. And so, the storyteller was saying, when Thornbark chose healing over vengeance, he discovered the secret that transforms every ending into a beginning. For you see, children, the deepest magic is not in the power to destroy what threatens us, but in the wisdom to transform it into something that serves life. A small girl raised her hand. But what happened to Thornbark after that? Did he really die? The storyteller's eyes twinkled. Well now, that's the beautiful mystery, isn't it? Some say he sleeps still in the grove above us, dreaming dreams that keep all the forests of Middle-earth healthy. Others say he wanders the world in a new form, part Ent and part Entwife, tending gardens wherever they're needed most. And some say, added a voice from the edge of the firelight, Thornbark himself, though none but the storyteller seemed to recognize him in his humble traveler's guise, that the question of what happened to him misses the point entirely. The storyteller smiled knowingly and gestured for the apparent stranger to join their circle. And what would the point be, friend? That stories like his don't end, Thornbark replied, settling cross-legged among the children with surprising grace. For one so tall, they grow. Each person who hears the tale carries it forward, plants it in new soil, tends it with their own experiences. The Thornbark who refused sleep became the seed for countless others who choose vigilance over despair, healing over destruction. One of the older children, perhaps 12 summers, spoke up with the seriousness that comes with approaching adulthood. But how do we know when to fight and when to heal? How do we choose between them? Thornbark considered the question with the weight it deserved. Around the fire, even the adults had grown quiet, sensing that something important was being discussed. The deepest wisdom I've learned, he said finally, is that the choice is rarely between fighting and healing. It's between fighting for destruction or fighting for renewal. When I faced Blackroot, I fought him. But I fought him by choosing to heal what he had corrupted. The battle was real, but the weapon was love. As the night deepened and the stories continued, Thornbark found himself thinking about the full circle his long existence had traced. From the young Ent who feared sleep as ending, through the vigilant guardian who bore the fire of stars, to this new being who understood that the deepest wakefulness came from being fully present to each moment's possibility for growth. The festival would end with dawn, the pilgrims would return to their homes, and the grove would settle back into its patient rhythm of season. But the connections made here, the stories shared, and the wisdom passed along would continue growing in hearts and minds across Middle-earth. And in that ongoing growth, Thornbark found the answer to the question that had driven his long vigil. What do the Guardians guard against? Not any single threat, but against the forgetting of what makes life worth protecting, the wonder, the beauty, the connections between all living things. As the first light of dawn touched the silver bark of the grove's trees, Thornbark smiled and began to sing, not in the slow speech of the Ents or the ancient tongue of the Eldar, but in the new language that was emerging from the marriage of all wisdom traditions, the song of a Middle-earth learning once again to grow in harmony. The festival was ending, but the festival was never really ending. Like the grove itself, it would appear wherever and whenever it was needed, in whatever form served the continuing story of life's triumph over all that would diminish it.